After Carthage's bitter defeat in the First Punic War, a darker conflict ignited, not against Rome, but within its own empire. The mercenaries, once hailed as saviors, turned into executioners, and the land was drenched in blood without mercy or honor. Cities were besieged, civilians slaughtered, and the struggle became a war without end, a truceless war. Although the Treaty of Lutatius between Lutatius Catulus and Hamilcar Barca, which ended the First Punic War in 241 BC, introduced an era of reconciliation between Carthage and Rome, it did not usher in a period of peace for either side. Both soon found themselves engaged in intense conflicts with other adversaries. For Carthage, this meant a life-and-death struggle with its mutinous mercenaries and the subsequent establishment of an empire in Spain. For Rome, it entailed a renewed and prolonged conflict with the Gauls and an expansion of its power across the Adriatic into Illyria. The 23 years that separated the First from the Second Punic War were marked by significant activity and change for both states, involving territorial expansion and constitutional adjustments. These developments ultimately led to renewed open conflict between Carthage and Rome. After the conclusion of the peace treaty, Hamilcar led his army from Eryx to Lilybæum and entrusted its command to Gisco, the governor of the city. Anticipating the potential challenge of repatriating the mercenaries, Gisco sent them to Carthage in manageable groups over several months. He aimed to settle the pay arrears of each group and dispatch the different national contingents to their respective countries before the next group arrived. This was a well-thought-out plan to keep the resettlement issue under control. However, the Carthaginian authorities had a different perspective. They chose to quarter the mercenaries in the city, hoping to avoid further draining the already depleted treasury, and intended to entertain them so well that they would forego at least part of the money owed to them. This decision was naive and short-sighted. After years of strenuous campaigning, where their desires were either unmet or forcibly fulfilled, the mercenaries eagerly indulged in all the delights the city had to offer. Concerned about the resulting chaos and unruly behavior that persisted day and night, the Carthaginians decided to take a different approach. They approached the officers of the mercenaries and requested that they relocate their men to the remote town of Utica, which was conveniently distant from Carthage. In exchange, they offered to provide an advance of gold to cover the mercenaries' immediate expenses, with the remainder to follow as soon as possible. The proposal was accepted, and the move was carried out. However, once the soldiers were settled in Utica and no longer constrained by discipline, idleness and boredom led to discontent. Speculation arose among the troops concerning the amount owed to them. It was not just a matter of unpaid wages. Significant rewards had been promised by senior Carthaginian officers during periods of extraordinary difficulty and danger. Just when expectations were at their peak, Hanno the Great, who was responsible for affairs in Africa, arrived at Utica. Instead of making the expected payments or providing an update on the arrangements being made, he explained the dire state of the Carthaginian economy and offered a settlement on greatly reduced terms. This announcement ignited the already intense atmosphere. The mercenary army included Spaniards, Gauls, slingers from the Balearic Islands, and a few Greek fugitives and slaves. However, the majority were Africans. Meeting together first as tribes and national contingents, the men found their general resentment breaking through language barriers, expressing their anger in collective assemblies. Hanno faced the challenge of pacifying the angered mercenaries and reducing their demands. He attempted to convince their officers to act as mediators. But due to differences in education, intelligence, and bias among the officers, his message became distorted. Rumors spread, and suspicion turned into outright distrust, especially because the negotiator was not one of their own generals, but a stranger who had not served in Sicily. Disregarding Hanno's authority and mistrusting their officers, over 20,000 mercenaries marched on Carthage and settled at Tunis, just 14 miles south of the city. The Carthaginians realized they had made two significant errors. First, they should not have gathered such a large group of mercenaries in one place without a citizen force to oppose them. Second, they should have kept the mercenaries' wives and children as hostages to ensure good behavior and use them as bargaining chips in the pay negotiations. Despite the growing mistrust, both sides sought a compromise, and it's possible that the mercenaries' exaggerated claims were a strategic move to secure the best deal possible. The Carthaginians, therefore, appointed Commander Gisco to solve this crisis. Gisco sailed to Tunis with the intention of mitigating the growing unrest among the mercenaries. He first addressed their officers and then the soldiers, speaking to each group according to their national affiliations. Gisco explained the dire financial straits of the Carthaginian Republic and appealed to their loyalty. He then began distributing the funds he had brought, which were sufficient to cover the arrears of pay, but not the additional claims for items such as corn and horses. Gisco assured them that these additional claims would be settled at a later date. The majority of the mercenaries might have accepted this arrangement if not for the influence of two agitators with personal stakes in opposing the Carthaginian terms. The first was Spendius, a Roman fugitive slave who, despite his valor as a soldier, feared certain death by torture if returned to the Romans. The second was Mathos, an African who had been a principal instigator of the current troubles and was acutely aware that he would likely face a similar fate if captured by the Carthaginians. Together, Spendius and Mathos exploited the anxieties and suspicions of their fellow mercenaries. They particularly incited fear among the African contingent by suggesting that once the other nationalities were repatriated, the Africans would be left to face Carthaginian retribution alone. This stirred up a mob mentality, and those who tried to advocate for moderation, whether they were officers or soldiers, were attacked and stoned to death. Spendius and Mathos were appointed as generals of the mercenary force and immediately ordered the capture of Gisco and his staff. They further solidified their authority by using the funds brought by Gisco to pay the arrears themselves. This led to the declaration of a relentless war against Carthage, as described by Polybius. Messengers were sent to all occupied cities, urging them to join the revolt and regain their freedom. While Utica and Hippodiaritis refused, most cities readily consented, sending troops and supplies, bolstering the mercenaries by an additional 70,000 men. Spendius and Mathos then divided their army, with Mathos launching attacks on Utica and Hippodiaritis while firmly holding their camp at Tunis, and Spendius laying siege to Carthage, cutting off the city and confining the garrison within its walls. What started as a pay dispute escalated into a full-scale revolt, known as the Mercenary War, which threatened the existence of Carthage as a state over the following 3 years. During challenging times, drastic actions were necessary. Hanno, as the commander of Carthage's African army, took the field. Most of the African soldiers in his force remained loyal, as they were accustomed to acting against their fellow Africans. The non-African contingent, which had remained quartered in Carthage following the expulsion of the Sicilian army, also remained loyal. The few troops still stationed in Sicily were promptly paid and redeployed under Hanno's command. Additionally, funds were raised to hire fresh troops. Carthage undertook extensive preparations to strengthen their military capabilities. The surviving triremes and 50 oar vessels were refitted, and all able-bodied citizens were armed. A fresh cavalry unit was formed, and the remaining 100 elephants in their possession were mustered. By the time Hanno had assembled this reinforced force, the rebels had already blockaded Utica and Hippodiaritis. It is likely that both the Carthaginian and rebel armies consisted of similar types and proportions of troops, with the exception that the rebels did not have elephants. At the start of 240 BC, Hanno finally initiated his campaign against the mercenary rebels. He deliberately avoided the Tunis area and instead targeted the besiegers of Utica. Polybius does not provide a specific reason for this decision, but it can be inferred that Hanno deemed it too risky to confront the main rebel forces directly. Nevertheless, he recognized the necessity of taking action to maintain the morale of both his fellow citizens and his own army. Additionally, avoiding the rebels entirely posed the risk of being cut off from supplies and ultimately being defeated. Utica was the central point of the rebels' extended strategic front. Hanno likely calculated that if this position could be broken and the attackers of Utica defeated, Carthage would gain two strategic bases from which to launch further operations. This would force the remaining enemy forces into a defensive posture and disrupt their coordination. Moreover, the reopening of the seas in spring would re-establish Carthage's vital contact with the outside world. Consequently, Hanno first moved to aid the besieged city of Utica, aiming to strike fear into the enemy with the presence of his elephants. He set sail from Carthage and landed near Utica undetected. Hanno then established a camp outside Utica without opposition and made contact with the defenders. This detail indicates that the rebels did not have the town surrounded by entrenchments, but were blockading it from their own fortified camp instead. Soon, the defenders of Utica used their siege engines to intimidate the rebels.
Libyan infantry!
Meanwhile, Hanno ordered his entire army to charge at the rebel camp. The Carthaginian elephants quickly broke through the encircling entrenchments and devastated the camp, forcing the mercenaries to flee into the surrounding hills. Although Polybius does not mention them, it is clear that Hanno's other troops followed the elephants in the assault. Here, the narrative takes an unusual turn. Instead of pursuing the fleeing enemy, Hanno called off his army. This decision might have been due to the exhaustion of his troops, who may have marched a considerable distance at a vigorous pace to make their surprise appearance. Alternatively, Hanno's own treatment of his body suggests he might have sustained some injury, albeit not a severe one. Consequently, his men returned to the captured camp, seemingly taking it for themselves. Hanno, ignoring all precautions for their safety, entered Utica to attend to his own needs. He appeared to believe that he had achieved a complete victory and finished the war. Polybius attributes this behavior to Hanno's limited military experience, noting that his previous opponents, Numidians and Libyans, typically continued fleeing for several days once routed. However, it is unlikely that Hanno genuinely believed that a victory at Utica, no matter how decisive, had concluded the war. The enemy forces at both Hippodiaritis and Tunis remained undefeated and were, in fact, growing stronger. Despite this, Hanno might have been convinced by the rebels' panic and disorder that they posed no immediate threat to his army in their annexed camp. This camp was now guarded by its own defenses, including timbers, palisades, brushwood, and the elephant corps. Hanno may have planned to renew hostilities after tending to his own needs and allowing his troops some rest. Confident after their success, Hanno's men relaxed their guard. Many left the camp, presumably to visit Utica and the surrounding farms to procure or seize fresh food and goods. This lapse in vigilance occurred the day after their success, or possibly even on the same day if the rebel camp had been taken in the morning. Hanno underestimated the enemy's resilience, a mistake that would prove costly. Among the rebels were veterans well-versed in Hamilcar Barca's hit-and-run guerrilla tactics from the Sicilian campaigns, as Polybius notes. These seasoned fighters, accustomed to retreating only to strike back with renewed vigor, now saw their opportunity. The new recruits among the rebels needed little encouragement to join the counterattack. They had retained their armor and weapons, as demonstrated by their swift response. As Hanno's men relaxed their guard and streamed out of their camp, the rebel army, bolstered by both veterans and new recruits, descended from the hills in force. The sudden and powerful counterattack caught the Punic army off guard, plunging them into panic. The rebels killed many of Hanno's soldiers and forced the rest to flee disgracefully up to the walls and gates of Utica. In this fierce engagement, the rebels not only recaptured their camp, but also dealt a sharp retaliation for Hanno's earlier success. The rebels' counteroffensive was executed with precision, and they managed to seize all the Punic baggage and artillery. The once confident Carthaginian forces were now on the defensive, their earlier gains nullified by the loss of their camp and critical military supplies. The artillery now fell into enemy hands, effectively turning Carthage's own weaponry against them. Polybius adds a caustic remark that Hanno, in effect, had transported Utica's artillery only to hand it over to the rebels. Despite their setback, Hanno's troops, like the rebels before them, lived to fight another day. Although now without their camp and war machines, and sheltering under the town walls, they were not as vulnerable as they appeared. Surprisingly, the victorious rebels did not press their advantage. Polybius does not provide an explanation for this missed opportunity. At this juncture, he loses interest in the campaign's details, summarizing the remainder of it in just a few lines, after having devoted a considerable amount of attention to its opening phase. It is clear that the Punic army remained intact, as Hanno soon resumed operations. It is plausible that the elephants played a significant role in preventing a total rout, and that some of Utica's garrison may have come out to support Hanno's army. Hanno himself might have emerged to rally his troops. What is certain is that his army did not seek refuge within Utica. Had they done so, the rebels, now armed with captured siege engines, could have besieged the city indefinitely. Instead, Hanno was found operating in the countryside only a few days later, indicating that his forces had regrouped and were still a formidable presence. The outcome had little impact on Carthage's situation. The rebels maintained their siege of Utica, Hippodiaritis, and Carthage. The Carthaginian field army withdrew from Utica and regrouped. Throughout the remainder of the year, Hanno engaged in skirmishes with Spendius's forces, failing to capitalize on opportunities to engage or outmaneuver them. Renowned military historian Nigel Bagnall criticized Hanno's performance as a field commander, citing his incompetence. Additionally, another Carthaginian army, led by Hamilcar in 240 BC, clashed with rebel leader Spendius at the Battle of Bagradas River.
Following the Battle of Utica in 240 BC, Hamilcar Barca assumed command from Hanno, inheriting a force described by Polybius as a mix of freshly recruited mercenaries, rebel deserters, citizen cavalry, infantry, and 70 elephants. This army, though assembled with urgency, would have required substantial preparation and coordination, particularly as new mercenary arrivals were delayed until spring due to seasonal sailing conditions. The composition of Hamilcar's army suggests a patchwork force, both in terms of skill and loyalty. Citizen levies were likely organized immediately after the mutiny began, with deserters augmenting their numbers in the preceding months. However, despite these reinforcements, Hamilcar faced the daunting task of leading a force that was numerically inferior and potentially less cohesive than the rebel forces they confronted. Recognizing the strategic importance of acting swiftly, Hamilcar moved to take the offensive with minimal delay. His primary challenge was the geography around Carthage. The isthmus connecting Carthage to the mainland was only about 2,000 yards wide, and to the south lay a rugged, defensible range of hills heavily guarded by Mathos' rebel troops. Hamilcar's task was not only to overcome these natural and man-made barriers, but to do so with a force still in the process of consolidation and training, a test of both strategic acumen and leadership under severe constraints. The initial strategy likely aimed for Hanno to decisively defeat or at least contain the rebels around Utica, which would have ideally weakened rebel morale in the surrounding areas. Hamilcar, in turn, would join the effort as soon as circumstances allowed, possibly coordinating a two-pronged assault on the rebel forces stationed at Tunis. However, Hanno's failure forced a revision of this plan. Carthaginian strategy remained shaped by its limited resources. Hamilcar, with only 10,000 troops, could not afford to openly challenge Mathos' forces at Tunis. The rebels held firm control over key strategic points, including the single bridge spanning the Bagradas River and the passes through the nearby hills. This effectively blocked any conventional advance. To break out into the open countryside, Hamilcar needed to achieve surprise, as his force was too small to confront heavily guarded passes or attempt a crossing at the well-defended bridge. Thus, his strategy required careful planning and tactical ingenuity, relying on surprise attacks or exploiting weaknesses in the rebels' defenses, rather than engaging in direct confrontation, which would have exposed his army to overwhelming opposition. Polybius provides a detailed account of Hamilcar's initial maneuvers, more thorough than his description of Hanno's efforts. At first, the prospects of attacking the rebel forces seemed unlikely. However, Hamilcar noticed a natural advantage caused by a quirk of tide and weather. When the wind blew from the west and the tide was low, a sandbar would be partially exposed across the salt flats at the mouth of the river, making it possible to ford. Seizing this opportunity, Hamilcar waited for the conditions to align. When they did, he led his men out of the city under the cover of darkness. By using the sandbar, they successfully crossed before dawn without detection. From there, Hamilcar directed his forces inland, following the course of the Bagradas River to secure the strategically important bridge. Afterward, they advanced in an extended line northward across the plain, positioning themselves to confront the rebels with the advantage of surprise. After Spendius overcame his initial shock at the sudden change in events, he quickly moved to confront Hamilcar. Leading the 10,000 men who had been stationed around the bridge, he was soon reinforced by an additional 15,000 troops from Utica. Confident in his numerical superiority, Spendius advanced toward the Carthaginians with the aim of overwhelming them. He extended his left flank in an effort to outflank Hamilcar's forces and encircle them, pinning the Carthaginians against the river, thus limiting their ability to maneuver or retreat. Hamilcar organized his forces with the 70 elephants leading as the vanguard, followed by the citizen cavalry and light-armed skirmishers in the middle, and the heavy infantry bringing up the rear. It was unusual for cavalry to be positioned behind the elephants, as they typically took on a leading or flanking role in ancient warfare. Additionally, there is no mention of cavalry scouts operating ahead or along the flanks of the formation. One interpretation is that Hamilcar's cavalry was too limited in number to fulfill their traditional roles. However, they were still numerous enough to play a decisive role in the battle and are estimated to have numbered at least 1,000, which was a reasonable cavalry-to-infantry ratio for the time. Despite their smaller numbers, the cavalry would have been a crucial element in Hamilcar's strategy. Despite their unusual positioning, the cavalry and light-armed troops were still fulfilling their typical role of screening the infantry. The light infantry may have been relatively few in number, possibly no more than 1,000. These units, in turn, were screened by the elephants at the front. Given Hamilcar's awareness of his force being heavily outnumbered, the elephants were essential for any confrontation. Placing them in the vanguard provided additional protection against a frontal assault, while the cavalry and light troops could fan out from the center to counter any flanking threats if needed. However, this formation also meant that the entire army was limited to the slower pace of the elephants. By the time of the impending battle, the elephants had already marched nearly 24 kilometers since the previous evening. Even with brief rests along the way, they were likely fatigued and moving slowly, which influenced the overall movement of Hamilcar's forces as they prepared for the clash with the rebels. This fatigue and slow pace were key factors in the coordination and timing of the approaching battle. As previously noted, Hamilcar was fully aware of his numerical disadvantage, yet he sought to engage in a decisive battle. The two-pronged attack by Spendius from the west and north was unlikely to have caught him off guard. In fact, it is highly probable that Hamilcar had anticipated this and had planned his response accordingly. Long before the engagement, it would have been evident that, wherever he met the rebel forces, he would be significantly outnumbered. This situation required his troops to master additional maneuvers beyond the basics of maintaining formation and charging on command, such as executing an orderly retreat. The key maneuvers Hamilcar employed, initially wheeling his troops around in a controlled retreat, then turning them again to face the enemy, were likely practiced within the city walls and open spaces of Carthage. However, given that not all, and perhaps only a minority, of his forces were battle-hardened veterans, the maneuvers had to be kept relatively simple to avoid confusion and disarray. These straightforward tactical movements ensured that even a largely inexperienced army could maintain discipline and cohesion in the face of overwhelming odds. These considerations are essential for understanding Polybius' account of the battle. According to his narrative, the two rebel divisions either came into sight of one another, or based on another interpretation of the Greek text, physically joined together like the two parts of a hinge. In either case, they were close enough to communicate by shouting, offering mutual encouragement, and reinforcing their confidence. The rebels believed they had successfully trapped the Carthaginians in the center of their combined forces, convinced that Hamilcar's army had been encircled and was at their mercy. As the rebel armies came into view, still some distance away across the countryside, Hamilcar ordered his forces to halt and signaled a retreat. The fact that there was soon a noticeable gap between his cavalry and infantry suggests that they were not marching in a tightly compact formation, though they were not widely dispersed either. Seeing the Carthaginians in retreat, the rebel forces quickened their pace to close the distance, but in doing so, they began to lose their cohesion. It is crucial to note that both rebel divisions likely accelerated their advance in this manner. Polybius strongly implies this, and logically, if one division increased its speed to attack, the other would have felt compelled to follow suit in order to maintain coordination and offer support. This rush to catch the retreating Carthaginians contributed to the disorder in the rebel ranks, weakening their overall formation and making them more vulnerable to counterattack. Spendius had, or appeared to have, several tactical options at his disposal. As noted earlier, the rebels initially believed they could trap the Carthaginians against the river, with the division from Utica attacking their northern flank and the bridge division advancing from the west to strike their rear. Alternatively, Spendius could have employed a more deliberate strategy, allowing one division to engage while holding the other in reserve for a decisive blow once the Carthaginians were fully committed in battle. Unfortunately for the rebels, Spendius lacked the strategic finesse of commanders like Hannibal, who famously executed such a maneuver at Cannae, or Napoleon, whose mastery of this tactic was evident at Austerlitz. Instead, Spendius seems to have lost control over the movements of his forces. As the Carthaginians continued their eastward retreat, approximately a kilometer ahead, the plan for a coordinated flank attack was abandoned, replaced by a disorganized direct pursuit. One of the rebel divisions, likely the force from Utica, surged ahead of the other and broke formation in their eagerness to catch the retreating enemy. At this moment of disarray, Hamilcar seized the opportunity to strike, launching his counterattack against the overextended and vulnerable rebel troops. First, he halted the infantrymen's retreat and, in Polybius's words, ordered them to wheel around after their turnabout. This turnabout likely refers to their previous maneuver to retreat. Now, they wheeled to face west once again. As the cavalry and elephants, having retreated alongside the infantry, approached, Hamilcar signaled them to execute the same maneuver. By this point, the rebel forces, now in disarray, were likely a disorderly half-kilometer away. These movements were among the simplest any army could learn once they had mastered the basic skills of maintaining formation and executing charges. However, the key to success in such maneuvers lay not only in technical proficiency, but also in psychological preparedness, maintaining composure during a retreat and readiness to attack when commanded. Clearly, Hamilcar had drilled his newly formed army in these essential principles, ensuring they could execute such fundamental maneuvers effectively under pressure. The rebel forces, many of whom were recent recruits, suddenly found themselves facing a coordinated strike by Hamilcar's elephants and cavalry, both advancing in disciplined formation. Adding to their distress, they could see behind these advancing units the organized ranks of over 7,000 heavy infantry. What had begun as disorganization quickly spiraled into outright panic, turning their retreat into a chaotic flight. Meanwhile, the 2nd Rebel Division, advancing from the rear in similarly loose formation, had limited visibility of the unfolding events ahead. When their fleeing comrades, terror-stricken, crashed into their ranks, it naturally sparked fears that a catastrophe had occurred. This confusion was compounded when they saw Hamilcar's cavalry and elephants bearing down on them, cutting down and trampling those attempting to flee. Given the disarray and the sight of their comrades being overtaken, the panic that spread through the 2nd Division was inevitable, leading to a complete breakdown of their morale and cohesion. Polybius employs compression and implicitness in his description of the battle. He states that the first group of rebels, upon colliding with the second, destroyed both themselves and their comrades, and notes that many were trampled when the cavalry and elephants attacked them at close quarters. However, he cannot literally mean that the fleeing first army annihilated the second. If that were the case, there would be no rebels left for the Carthaginian forces to confront, and it raises the question of what the rebels would have been doing in the meantime. More plausibly, Polybius is suggesting that the two groups of rebels clashed, possibly with one faction attempting to stop the other from fleeing the battlefield. After a brief, chaotic engagement, they likely suffered mutual casualties before ultimately being overwhelmed by the Carthaginian forces. Describing the encounter as destroyed both themselves and their comrades serves as a literary image rather than a precise factual account. It captures the chaos and devastation of the moment while allowing for a more nuanced understanding of the events that unfolded. The reported killing of 6,000 rebels represents a significant portion, nearly 25% of Spendius' forces, particularly if we consider that this loss was attributed solely to Hamilcar's cavalry and elephants. With only 70 elephants and approximately 1,000 cavalrymen available, it is likely that the infantry also contributed to these casualties and helped secure 2,000 prisoners. However, the scale of the rebel losses is surprising, especially if many were in flight across the countryside. Elephants, unlike cavalry, cannot maintain a rapid pursuit over long distances due to their considerable weight. Yet, Polybius indicates that the battle occurred close to the Bagradas river. One may infer that Hamilcar successfully drove many rebels toward the bank of this fast-flowing river, where they were cornered and subsequently overwhelmed by a combined assault from cavalry, elephants, infantry, and light-armed troops who targeted stragglers. This operation exemplified Hamilcar's tactical acumen, achieving success in two significant ways. First, through the element of surprise afforded by the nighttime river crossing, and second, through a well-executed tactical maneuver. Such a display of superior leadership not only contributed to the victory, but also likely bolstered the morale of Hamilcar's troops. Although this battle is often overshadowed by larger conflicts to come, Hamilcar Barca's victory on the banks of the Bagradas River serves as a classic example of imaginative and skillful military leadership. Following the Battle of the Bagradas River in 240 BC, Hamilcar Barca chose not to link up with Hanno, who was stationed at Hippo Acra with a diminished force following his defeat at Utica. Instead, Hamilcar advanced through the surrounding region, though his limited resources constrained his strategic options. His campaign faced significant resistance, particularly from forces harassing his movements from the foothills, which made progress slow and challenging. Given his restricted manpower, Hamilcar was unable to secure captured towns with garrisons or organize supply convoys to Carthage. However, the course of his campaign suggests that securing and transporting supplies was not his primary objective. Instead, his strategy focused on undermining support for the rebellion by demonstrating the futility of the rebels' primary tactic, blockading Carthage. Hamilcar aimed to sway Libyan communities to his side, either by persuasion or intimidation. By spreading his efforts across a broad area, he sought to create confusion and disrupt the rebellion's cohesion, thereby weakening its overall effectiveness. Hamilcar's strategy was undeniably risky. Moving inland meant that he would be operating beyond the reach of direct support from Carthage, leaving him vulnerable if he encountered significant resistance. He was well aware that the rebels would not permit him to march unchallenged through the interior. Moreover, it is likely he anticipated or had already learned that the rebels were seeking assistance from the Numidian tribes, long-standing adversaries of Carthage. The Numidians posed a particular threat due to their highly skilled and adaptable cavalry, which could disrupt Hamilcar's operations and supply lines. This risk may explain why, as Polybius subtly implies, Hamilcar secured reinforcements before embarking on his inland campaign. These additional troops could have been sent from Carthage, either via Utica or possibly across the Gulf of Hammamet, depending on the direction of his movements. The reinforcements would have bolstered his forces, enabling him to better counter potential threats and engage in the protracted operations required to weaken the rebellion. As the Carthaginian forces advanced into the interior, they were closely shadowed by the rebel army under the command of Spendius and Atrocities, the latter leading the Gauls. Many of the rebels, particularly those not directly involved in earlier engagements at the Bagradas River, remained fresh and capable. Recognizing their disadvantage against Hamilcar's superior cavalry and war elephants in open combat, the rebels adopted guerrilla tactics, likely inspired by Hamilcar's own earlier strategies. They avoided the plains, where Carthaginian cavalry and elephants had the upper hand, and instead moved through the rugged foothills, awaiting reinforcements and a strategic opportunity to confront the Carthaginians. During this phase of the campaign, Hamilcar led his army on an extended march to the east, though the precise extent of his movement remains uncertain. At some point, his forces became trapped in a mountain valley. Modern historians propose various locations for this critical moment, including areas near Tunis, Grombalia, ancient Nepharis, the lower Bagradas River, the Milan River, or regions between Utica and Hippo Acra, as well as near modern Souk al-Jamaa. It is unclear from the historical sources whether Hamilcar's entrapment resulted from a deliberate stratagem by Spendius or a miscalculated attempt by Hamilcar to attack an isolated segment of the rebel forces. Regardless, the Carthaginian camp found itself in a precarious position, surrounded on three sides. Spendius and Atrocities held positions on one flank, newly mobilized Libyan units blocked the front, and Numidian cavalry, arriving from the west, closed in on the rear. Polybius's account suggests that Hamilcar had been advancing east or southeast at the time, aligning with the reported positioning of the Numidians and rebel forces. This complex encirclement underscored the rebels' growing coordination and tactical acumen, putting Hamilcar in a critical situation. The battlefield, though expansive enough to accommodate a full-scale engagement, saw relatively small forces compared to larger conflicts of the era. Hamilcar commanded between 10,000 and 15,000 troops, while the opposing forces, under Spendius, Atrocities, and their Numidian allies, numbered over 20,000. The rebel contingent included approximately 8,000 troops led by Spendius and Atrocities, around 2,000 Numidian cavalry, and a Libyan force estimated at 10,000 to 15,000. Hamilcar's position within an encircled plain presented a significant strategic challenge. Despite his substantial force, he was outnumbered by the combined strength of the rebels and their allies. The situation was exacerbated by the potential for prolonged encirclement. Although Spendius did not directly assault the Punic camp, likely because it was well chosen and fortified, reflecting Hamilcar's expertise in position warfare honed during the Sicilian campaigns, the threat of starvation loomed. Even if the camp had a sufficient water supply, its ability to sustain the army in the face of dwindling provisions was doubtful. Polybius emphasizes the gravity of Hamilcar's dilemma. He faced a stark choice: risk a battle against a numerically superior force, or remain in his defensive position and endure the slow attrition of hunger. What followed next, as Polybius suggests, was both unexpected and transformative. A young Numidian nobleman named Mathos, commanding a force of approximately 2,000 cavalry, likely the entirety of the Numidian contingent supporting the rebels, initiated a dramatic shift in the balance of power. After this event, Spendius is mentioned engaging the Carthaginian forces only with his own troops, those of Atrocities and the newly raised Libyan division, suggesting that Narr'havas's defection significantly weakened the rebel alliance. Narr'havas's decision to approach the Carthaginian camp appears to have been motivated by both familial ties to Carthage and a personal admiration for Hamilcar Barca. Seeking an audience with the general, Narrabas was granted a personal interview during which he pledged his loyalty to Hamilcar and transferred the allegiance of his entire cavalry force to the Carthaginians. This unexpected reinforcement not only bolstered Hamilcar's position, but also underscored his reputation as a leader capable of inspiring loyalty, even among potential adversaries. Nerva's defection was a turning point, shifting the dynamics of the conflict and providing Hamilcar with a critical advantage in the face of overwhelming odds. With the morale of the Carthaginian forces soaring after an unexpected and encouraging turn of events, Hamilcar promptly made the decision to have his army abandon their defensive fortifications and organize into a battle formation. At this critical juncture, Hamilcar likely commanded a cavalry force numbering at least 3,000 and possibly more, adding considerable strength to his military capability. Seeing the opportunity to capitalize on the Carthaginian repositioning, Spendius, the rebel general, allied with the Libyan forces, led them down onto the open plain to confront the Carthaginians. Faced with the demoralization caused by Narrabas's defection from the rebel ranks, Spendius felt a pressing urgency to act decisively. By uniting his forces for a full frontal assault, he hoped to bolster the morale of his own troops, as well as that of the newly arrived Libyan reinforcements, who were now compelled to rally against the common enemy. However, Spendius's decision to consolidate his forces for an all-out attack, while seemingly a tactical choice, could be interpreted as a significant miscalculation. Had the rebels instead opted for a two-pronged assault, coordinating simultaneous attacks from their respective camps, it would have forced Hamilcar to split his attention and resources. This strategic maneuver could have significantly diminished Hamilcar's striking power and defensive capacity. With deft maneuvering and a bit of luck, the rebels might have disrupted the Carthaginian formation, thrown portions of their forces into disarray, and potentially weakened the effectiveness of their war elephants, which were a cornerstone of Hamilcar's army. Additionally, there was a risk that the presence of the Numidian allies might falter under the pressure of a divided offensive if things were not executed perfectly. One of the critical factors influencing Spendius's strategy was undoubtedly the inexperience of his Libyan reinforcements. The risk of a divided attack leading to confusion, where one group might strike too soon while another hesitated, was substantial. The bitter memory of how his previous engagement at the Bagradas had unraveled would have weighed heavily on Spendius's mind, reinforcing his desire for a more cohesive, singular assault rather than risking the chaos of a fragmented one. Terrain also played a pivotal role in shaping the battle dynamics. While the historian Polybius did not record detailed geographical features such as rivers or mountains in the vicinity of the battlefield, it is important to recognize that these operations were far from taking place in a barren desert landscape. Hamilcar would have strategically chosen his encampment location to maximize the advantages offered by the surrounding environment. If the Carthaginian forces were positioned behind natural obstacles or in a defensible area, a coordinated two-pronged assault from the rebels might have been rendered complex, if not entirely unfeasible. In the battle, the rebels faced a comprehensive and decisive defeat. As demonstrated in the earlier encounters at Bagradas, Spendius exhibited strategic acumen. However, his tactical prowess fell short. Details surrounding the exact circumstances of the loss remain unclear. Polybius, the ancient historian, provides some insights, noting that Spendius initiated an aggressive assault on the Carthaginian forces. This skirmish proved to be fiercely contested, with the elephants playing a significant and potentially game-changing role. One of the remarkable moments in the battle was attributed to Narrabas, who displayed exceptional bravery and skill. His actions likely included successfully routing the remaining cavalry forces of the rebel side. This maneuver allowed Hamilcar, commanding the Carthaginian infantry, to focus his forces on engaging the main body of the rebel infantry, aided by the formidable presence of the elephants. Spendius had hoped that the raw energy and fervor of his troops would compensate for any shortcomings in tactical sophistication. However, once the initial thrust was met with resilience, he found it challenging to reclaim the momentum amidst the chaos of the battle. Managing to maintain cohesion among his diverse forces became increasingly problematic as the fight progressed. It is evident that Hamilcar successfully intercepted Spendius' attack, halting it in its tracks. Following this, he likely launched a counteroffensive, utilizing his elephants in a crucial capacity, as Polybius emphasized, turning the tide of battle decisively in favor of the Carthaginians. The rebels did not falter immediately, as they had during the confrontation at the Bagradas River. Instead, they put up a fierce and determined resistance, engaging in a protracted and intense struggle that significantly exceeded the hardships they had faced in that earlier battle. This time, the rebel fighters showcased their tenacity, holding their lines against the advancing forces. In response to this staunch resistance, the Elephant Corps played a critical role, likely employing their overwhelming presence and tactical maneuvers to wear down the rebels. Their repeated charges were designed not only to wreak havoc, but also to disrupt the rebels' formations, creating fractures in their ranks that the Punic infantry could then exploit. The sight of massive elephants thundering into battle would have been both intimidating and disorienting, likely prompting confusion among the rebel forces. Moreover, the timing of Narav's cavalry was crucial. If they succeeded in driving away Spendius's cavalry, they would have the opportunity to either launch a decisive charge against the beleaguered rebel infantry, or, at the very least, to pursue them when they finally began to shatter under the relentless pressure of the Punic forces. As the rebel lines began to show signs of cracking, the cavalry could effectively take advantage of the situation, further demoralizing their foes and turning the tide of battle in favor of the Punic coalition. Polybius reported that rebel losses amounted to 10,000 dead and 4,000 captured, figures that have been deemed excessive, much like his estimates for the Bagradas victory. There is no means to verify these numbers. While the significant disparity between the slain and captured may seem questionable, it is worth noting that Hannibal inflicted similar casualties in multiple well-documented battles, which, like this one, did not signify the war's conclusion. If Polybius's figures are accurate, they suggest a devastating defeat for Spendius and Atrocities. The rebel army, although not completely destroyed, appeared to disintegrate as a cohesive fighting force. Hamilcar likely incurred some losses as well. However, he was now free to operate as he wished. Spendius, Atrocities, and presumably some of their men managed to escape to the coast. Hamilcar displayed a well-considered magnanimity. He enlisted those prisoners willing to serve under his command while gathering the others into their respective national contingents. He informed them that they would be pardoned and free to go wherever they wished. However, he cautioned that if they chose to take up arms against Carthage again, no mercy would be afforded to them. They were subsequently dismissed. Spendius interpreted Narabas's defection as a direct result of Hamilcar's diplomatic and generous treatment of those who aligned with Carthage. This perception deepened his fear of losing control over his forces, as he recognized that such favorable terms would likely not extend to him or the other rebel leaders. In response, and likely under pressure from his senior advisors, particularly Atrocities, Spendius sought to eliminate any possibility of reconciliation between the two sides. To solidify the rebels' commitment and prevent any reconciliation, Spendius ordered a harsh punishment for 700 Carthaginian prisoners, including the notable commander Gisco. The prisoners were subjected to severe mistreatment and ultimately executed in a manner designed to instill fear and deter further defections. This event marked a significant escalation in the conflict, prompting the Carthaginians to retaliate by enacting their own strict measures against rebel captives. These actions deepened the animosity between the two sides, further intensifying the war. From this point forward, the war descended into extraordinary brutality, earning the name Truceless War, as described by Polybius. Neither side showed any mercy. The Carthaginians, in particular, adopted the grim practice of having captured rebels executed by being trampled underfoot by war elephants. The mutual atrocities exemplified the intense animosity and desperation that defined this phase of the conflict. By autumn or winter of 240 BC, Hamilcar's inland campaign had progressed significantly. The subsequent phases of the campaign, operations against rebel-held towns, the pursuit by Spendius and Atrocities, and the ensuing developments, likely spanned at least 2 to 3 additional months. During this period, many significant events unfolded. However, reconstructing the precise sequence, as well as some specific details, requires careful interpretation of the sparse references provided by Polybius. Despite these limitations, the core elements of the narrative remain well established. Military preparations in Carthage continued unabated even after Hamilcar's departure with his army. As previously noted, it is unlikely that he left the city undefended. Following his initial victory, he appears to have incorporated reinforcements for his inland campaign. This suggests that recruitment efforts remained active, likely becoming significantly easier with the return of the summer sailing season. The spread of news about the major conflict in Africa across the Mediterranean would have attracted numerous eager mercenaries. Most of these, however, were drawn to Carthage and its coastal allies, as the Republic's navy actively patrolled to block aid to the rebels. Even with reinforcements, the combined forces of Hamilcar and Hanno the Great would have numbered only around 30,000 men. This figure was smaller than several Punic field armies deployed during the recent war against Rome, and still insufficient compared to the vast numbers of rebel forces. For both sides, therefore, it was crucial to continuously build and sustain effective armies and garrisons. A particularly alarming episode, likely occurring in the latter half of 240 BC, illustrates the extent of Carthage's ongoing military efforts during this critical period. During this period, the Carthaginians faced a significant setback in Sardinia when the mercenaries stationed there mutinied. Initially, these troops had not joined the mainland uprising, but Polybius later describes them as being eager to rival Mathos and Spendius. It is highly likely that these rebel leaders had been sending messages to Sardinia, urging the mercenaries to join the rebellion. Any development that increased Carthage's difficulties would have been actively encouraged by the mainland rebels. As previously noted, the Carthaginians had hoped that the Sardinian garrison would remain loyal. However, something triggered these troops to abandon their allegiance in a manner as violent as the mutinies in Tunis. The most straightforward explanation lies in financial strain. The mercenaries' pay and rations may have become irregular or even ceased altogether, likely due to the severe financial pressures Carthage faced. The costs of defending the Carthaginian heartlands during this protracted conflict likely took precedence, necessitating even dangerous reductions in expenditure. While financial hardship likely contributed to the Sardinian mutiny, it does not appear to be the sole cause. Nor is it entirely convincing that the mercenaries were suddenly swayed by the latest appeals from Africa. These mercenaries had resisted such persuasion earlier, and Mathos and Spendius, preoccupied with their own struggles and the financial burdens of war, were unlikely to have provided substantial support in the form of money or reinforcements. The actions of the Sardinian mutineers following their revolt offer valuable insights into their motivations. Their systematic and violent persecution of captured Carthaginians suggests a deep-seated animosity between the two groups. For this level of hostility to manifest, it likely stemmed from long-standing grievances extending back several years. Polybius's account of the Sardinian mutiny is relatively brief. He mentions that the mercenaries, under the command of Bostar, imprisoned him and his fellow citizens in a citadel and subsequently killed them. The term boetharchos, used to describe Bostar, is a Greek word not commonly found in Punic contexts until much later, when it referred to a military officer in charge of a region. This suggests that Bostar was likely the military governor of Sardinia and the commander of the mercenaries stationed there. The identity of the citadel mentioned by Polybius remains uncertain. Several possibilities exist. One candidate is Theros, a strongly fortified city on the west coast and one of Sardinia's leading Punic settlements, possibly its most significant. Another is Sulci, situated on a small island off the southwest coast. Corrales, modern-day Cagliari on the southern coast, is also a plausible option. However, the most compelling possibility is the ancient Punic fortress at Monte Sirai, located about 15 kilometers north of Sulci. Although Monte Sirai was not a town, it served as a fortified outpost and an advanced bastion for Sulci. Its location on a 200-meter-high ridge overlooking a fertile region made it a strategic stronghold. A plausible reconstruction of the events suggests that when the mercenaries under the governor Bostar, likely the largest group of mercenaries in Sardinia, mutinied, Bostar, possibly accompanied by a few loyal officers and soldiers, along with several Carthaginian citizens, retreated into the nearby citadel for refuge. While Polybius may have been referring only to Carthaginian officers, he specifically mentions citizens, which implies that able-bodied civilians may have also participated in the defense. Such involvement is not without precedent. For example, in 112 BC, when Jugurtha, a descendant of Massinissa, attacked his cousin and fellow Numidian king at Cirta, modern-day Constantine in Algeria, Italian traders in the city joined the resistance and were killed when the city surrendered. The fate of Bostar and those who took refuge with him was similarly grim. Once the citadel was captured, the defenders, including Bostar, perished. The means by which the mutineers overcame the citadel remain unclear. Despite its fortifications, starvation, fear, or false promises could have compelled its surrender. Alternatively, the mutineers may have stormed the fortress, though Polybius's account does not indicate that significant fighting occurred during its fall. This suggests that the citadel's defenses may have been breached through less direct means. The coup in Sardinia did not immediately place the entire island under the control of the mutineers. Polybius indicates that the towns fell to them only at a later stage. However, the elimination of Bostar effectively gave the mutineers control over the surrounding territory. Mercenary units stationed elsewhere on the island soon rallied to their cause. Yet, based on Polybius's account, these forces were initially unable to capture any towns. Carthaginian and Libya-Phoenician residents, possibly joined by some Punicized native Sardinians, managed to maintain control of the towns and sent urgent appeals for assistance to Carthage. Polybius dates these events to around the same time as the victory of Hamilcar and Narrabus, placing them during the summer of 240 BC. This timeline aligns with Carthage's response, the dispatch of an expedition under a general named Hanno to recover Sardinia. It is unlikely that Hanno's troops were drawn from Hanno the Great's army, as weakening that force would have been too risky. Instead, the soldiers were likely sourced from the new forces Carthage continued to assemble. The expedition's composition reveals that the troops sent were mercenaries, reflecting Carthage's reliance on such forces during this period. Similarly, Hamilcar's inland army also included newly recruited professional soldiers. This pattern underscores Carthage's efforts to rebuild and reinforce its military capacity amid the ongoing crises. Given Carthage's strained resources, the expedition to Sardinia was unlikely to have been a large force. However, it was reasonable to assume that the troops dispatched were at least comparable in size to the mutineer forces. Sending significantly fewer would have been ineffective, while deploying a substantially larger contingent would have been impractical given the volatile situation in Libya. Hanno's appointment and the organization of the expedition appear to have been executed with great urgency. By the time he landed in Sardinia, the mutineers had not yet secured control of the towns, which suggests that swift Carthaginian action disrupted their efforts. From Carthage's perspective, such speed was strategically crucial. A rapid counterstrike could protect the towns and their inhabitants, while also preventing the mutineers from consolidating their power. Failure to act quickly would not only risk the loss of Sardinia's resources, but also embolden the rebel leaders Mathos and Spendius, further complicating Carthage's already precarious position. Hanno's expedition to Sardinia ended disastrously. He failed to inspire his troops, and fortune was not on his side. Upon his arrival, his soldiers abandoned him, evidently seeing better prospects in joining the mutineers. This defection strongly indicates that his forces were composed of mercenaries, as it is implausible that Carthaginian citizen soldiers, even if available, would have deserted. Similarly, Libyan conscripts were unlikely to be part of his force, given their scarcity and the lack of trust the Republic could place in them. Polybius records that Hanno was seized by capture, implying that he attempted to flee when his men mutinied, though his efforts were ultimately in vain. Once captured, he suffered a brutal execution by crucifixion, a form of punishment associated with Punic practices and often employed for its symbolic impact. The mutineers likely intended this public display to send a clear message across Sardinia. It was a stark declaration of their contempt for Punic authority and a warning of the fate awaiting any other Carthaginian leaders who might fall into their hands. Reinforced by the defection of his troops, the mutineers were finally able to seize control of the towns, capturing and killing every Carthaginian they could find. The native Sardinian communities did not intervene to aid the Carthaginians. Had they done so, it is likely that the Carthaginians could have maintained their hold on at least some locations. Historical evidence shows that the Sardinians were well-armed and warlike, as demonstrated later when they eventually expelled the mutineers themselves. It is possible that the mercenaries convinced the Sardinians to remain neutral or even to provide support, likely through promises that were later broken. Once the Carthaginians on the island fell into their hands, the mutineers subjected them to unusual punishments, torturing and killing them all. This distinguishes the fate of these civilians from that of Hanno, who was crucified, a severe but not uncommon form of execution in Punic territories. Polybius's language implies the use of other, more horrific methods, though he refrains from detailing them. The brutality of these actions parallels the atrocities later committed against Gisco and his colleagues at Tunis. This calculated ferocity suggests that the hostility between the Carthaginian residents and the mercenaries tasked with defending them was deeply rooted, reflecting long-standing antagonism that erupted in this violent rebellion. The other major theater of the conflict was the coastal region surrounding Carthage. Militarily, little significant activity appears to have taken place in this area during this period. The rebels, who maintained control of Tunis and its surroundings, continued their blockade of Carthage, though it achieved little tangible effect. Similarly, the siege of Hippodioridus persisted in a state of apparent stalemate. Despite enduring a year-long blockade and significant pressure, the defenders of the city continued to resist effectively. Mathos, last reported near Hippodioridus, was now rejoined by Spendius and Atrocities. Both leaders, hardened and embittered by their earlier defeat, returned to the conflict with even greater resolve to wage war. The Carthaginian defenses along the coastal regions displayed a degree of strategic acumen, or perhaps fortuitous positioning, that counterbalanced the rebel forces concentrated around Tunis and Hippodioridus. Carthage itself remained well defended, supported by Hanno's nearby army, creating a stalemate that the rebels were unable or unwilling to break. Despite their numerical strength, the rebels did not combine their forces to launch a decisive attack on Hanno, Carthage, or Hippodioridus. It seems unlikely that Mathos and Spendius never considered such a strategy. More plausibly, they were constrained by the risks involved. Weakening the forces around Tunis to strike at Hanno, for example, could invite a counterattack from Carthage against the remaining forces. Similarly, concentrating their entire strength against Carthage's formidable defenses was unappealing, particularly with the possibility of Hanno harassing their rear, or worse, Hamilcar rapidly returning to the coastal front. The option of dispatching another large force against Hamilcar was equally unappealing, as it risked overextending their position. While some units were eventually sent to confront him, this occurred at a later stage, as subsequent events will demonstrate. At this stage, the year 240 was giving way to 239. Polybius's account suggests that the conflict during this period consisted of a series of smaller engagements and skirmishes rather than a decisive battle. It is reasonable to assume that if Hamilcar had fought a significant third battle, Polybius would have recorded it. The rebels, having learned from their previous defeats, likely adopted a more cautious strategy aimed at undermining Hamilcar's efforts indirectly. The newly mobilized rebel forces focused on harassing Hamilcar's movements and disrupting his supply lines, while attempting to reclaim towns that had surrendered to him and persuading others to remain loyal to the Libyans. These tactics, resembling those of the larger expedition planned a year later, emphasized maneuvering, minor skirmishes, and occasional ambush attempts. Such a form of warfare was drawn out, often lasting weeks or even months, reflecting the rebels' adaptation to a more protracted and evasive strategy. Hamilcar faced no immediate threat of defeat, but the ongoing operations placed significant strain on his army. Casualties from storming resistant towns would already have thinned his forces, and the possibility of desertions could not be dismissed, especially given the rebels' ruthless decree from Tunis. This proclamation, which declared that no prisoners would be taken, and that any captured soldier faced execution or mutilation, added a psychological burden to the conflict. Such factors likely influenced Hamilcar's decision to summon Hanno to join him. Hanno had made little progress against the coastal rebels and was not under significant pressure from them. The sieges of Hippodioridus and Utica were being effectively resisted, and Carthage remained well defended, with steady access to supplies and munitions by sea. In fact, a major convoy of provisions was expected from the Emporia region, bolstering the city's resilience. Hamilcar likely reasoned that combining their forces would provide a decisive advantage, allowing them to end the stalemate caused by fighting on two separate fronts. A united field army could confront the rebels directly, potentially defeating them decisively and then leveraging that success to advance on the coastal territories. Such a development, combined with the rebels' already fragile morale and fear of the Carthaginian policy of no quarter, could demoralize them completely. Before departing, Hanno needed to ensure the security of the loyal coastal regions, particularly since Utica was likely to come under renewed threat as soon as he left. To address this, he stationed 500 Carthaginian citizen soldiers at Hippodiaritis and the same number at Utica, or possibly 250 at each, though this interpretation is less convincing. These small contingents were only practical if Hanno trusted the town's local defenders to handle most of the burden. The presence of Carthaginian soldiers was intended to guarantee the loyalty of these key settlements. With these precautions in place, Hanno set out to join Hamilcar. The rendezvous between the two commanders, as noted by Polybius, raised optimism among the citizens of Carthage. The combined forces likely exceeded 20,000 troops, all of whom were now seasoned in the challenge of North African warfare. This formidable number at least equaled and possibly surpassed the rebels' field strength. The united armies launched new operations, and according to Polybius, multiple opportunities arose for decisive victories against the rebels. However, these promising prospects were consistently undermined by a fresh setback, preventing a conclusive resolution to the conflict. Hamilcar clearly expected the two armies to continue his strategy. They could either move together or operate separately, but in coordination, with the goal of distracting, frustrating, and trapping the enemy. This meant Hanno would have to work under Hamilcar's leadership. The Carthaginian Senate and magistrates likely understood this and approved the union of the armies, agreeing to Hamilcar's request. However, it's unlikely that Hanno was on board with this plan, especially after seeing the situation firsthand. In fact, he likely disagreed strongly with Hamilcar. Polybius doesn't explain the reasons for their quarrel, but it doesn't seem to be due to personal animosity, as the two had worked together before. Even later, despite personal conflicts, they were still able to coordinate military actions under pressure from their fellow citizens. However, this time, their disagreement disrupted the campaign. Hanno's opposition wasn't just a reaction to being treated as a subordinate. Hamilcar's months of campaigning in Libya hadn't succeeded in breaking the rebel effort or securing the territory he had taken. His harsh retaliation had only fueled more hostility from the Libyans. Hanno had every right to point out these failures and push for a change in strategy. Their quarrel severely hindered their efforts, as they not only missed opportunities to strike at the enemy, but also left themselves vulnerable to attacks. By this time, it was likely well into summer, and the war's momentum had shifted against Carthage. Hanno's withdrawal from the coastal front had left Utica and Hippodiaritis vulnerable. While Carthage itself remained protected by its formidable walls and defenders, Mathos and his rebel forces now enjoyed near-complete freedom of movement beyond the city. The small garrisons and citizens in Utica and Hippodiaritis were significantly outnumbered by the rebels surrounding them. However, the first major blow to Carthage came not from the rebels, but from nature. A sudden storm sank the supply ships transporting provisions from the Emporia region, the granary of Carthage, located approximately 200 miles south near Syrtis Minor. This loss of critical supplies was a severe setback. Worse still, the most devastating event was yet to come. The cities of Utica and Hippodiaritis, long loyal to Carthage, even during earlier crises such as Agathocles' invasion and Marcus Attilius Regulus's campaign, unexpectedly defected to the rebels. The inhabitants of both cities turned on the Carthaginian garrisons, executing over 500 Punic soldiers and throwing their bodies over the city walls. Requests from Carthage to retrieve and bury the dead were bluntly denied. With these defections, control over the northeastern Libyan coast slipped from Carthage's grasp almost overnight. Moreover, the rebel forces previously stationed outside the cities were now free to regroup and prepare for their next campaign. Emboldened by their recent successes, Mathos and Spendius decided on a bold and audacious move: a siege of Carthage itself. Carthage had been under blockade since the revolt began, which raises the question of how a siege differs from this ongoing blockade. The blockading forces, based in Tunis, had already cut the city off from its surrounding regions. Hamilcar's initial march to the Bagradas River had been possible only during the night and with the help of a strong wind at the river's mouth. Although the rebels likely took extra precautions to prevent any further breakouts, the effectiveness of the blockade probably varied over the course of the following year. After Hamilcar's victories and his operations through parts of Libya, the supply and support for the rebels around Carthage, Utica, and Hippodiaritis weakened, as previously mentioned. However, the situation changed once the rebellion regained momentum. Mathos and Spendius's decision to lay an actual siege to Carthage was both a bold military strategy and a significant propaganda victory, amplifying the psychological impact of the Carthaginians' recent defeats. This development likely encouraged continued Libyan support, both in terms of supplying munitions and financial resources while also attracting additional recruits. The rebellion may have even drawn mercenaries from abroad, despite Carthaginian naval patrols attempting to stop such movements. Notably, envoys from Utica were able to sail to Rome with a request for assistance, an effort the Carthaginians would have wanted to prevent, but ultimately failed to do so. Besieging the city, as opposed to blockading it, required bringing forces closer to its walls. This necessitated the construction of trenches and the use of protective equipment, such as mantlets. The rebels would occasionally attempt attacks on vulnerable sections of the city's fortifications. They had some siege engines, notably those captured from Hanno outside Utica earlier in the conflict. It's possible they crafted more, as some of the veterans from Sicily may have had the technical expertise, and craftsmen among the camp followers might have attempted to replicate Hanno's engines. However, if direct assaults were made, they were unsuccessful against the city's formidable fortifications and determined defenders. Another strategy often employed when brute force failed was internal treachery. This tactic was famously used by Hannibal and the Romans decades later. Despite possibly having the resources, Mathos and Spendius were unable to find any willing insiders. Solidarity within Carthage was notably strong, and even the slaves, who were likely numerous, did not cause any disturbances. This left the final, slowest, and least dependable option, attempting to starve the city into surrender. Before the siege of Carthage began, the deadlock between the Carthaginian generals was resolved. The army, or at least its citizen contingent, decided that Hanno should step down from command. According to Polybius, as the siege commenced, a replacement had already been chosen, a general named Hannibal. Hamilcar, Hannibal, and the Numidian lord continued operations across Libya with the goal of disrupting the siege by cutting off supplies to Mathos and Spendius. It seems Hannibal was given his own division, likely taking over Hanno's troops. Hamilcar intended for the two armies to operate separately, but work together against the enemy. While Hannibal had his own command, Polybius indicates that he still followed Hamilcar's orders. Before the new military leadership could make significant progress, the siege of Carthage finally began. As previously mentioned, Polybius reports that Hamilcar's goal, alongside Hannibal and Narrabas, was to cut off supplies to Mathos and Spendius from the interior. This suggests that much of Libya continued or resumed its resistance. However, the next few months of the war remain unclear, as Polybius provides only a brief summary. With help from their allies overseas, the Carthaginians managed to withstand the siege. In contrast, the forces of Mathos and Spendius were themselves besieged, as Hamilcar effectively restricted their supplies, forcing them to lift the siege. It can be inferred that this process took several months. The siege likely began in the second half of 239, with August or September being a reasonable estimate. Polybius emphasizes the critical importance of supplies from Sicily and Italy for Carthage. Building up sufficient stockpiles, especially with the upcoming winter, was as crucial for Carthage as denying supplies to the besiegers was for Hamilcar, Hannibal, and Narrabas. Significant supplies could only arrive before late autumn, as the non-sailing season in winter would limit further shipments. While some daring ships might continue amid storms, the flow of supplies would slow considerably by mid-October. The rebels chose not to launch a direct assault on Carthage, so their only realistic strategy was to attempt to starve the city into submission. However, as long as summer and early autumn persisted, they had no real chance of succeeding in this approach due to their lack of naval power. As noted earlier, the Syracusans under King Hiero had been providing vital supplies from the outset, a decision driven by self-interest, which Polybius praises. Now, Hiero intensified his efforts. The Romans also increased their support, though their motivations differed. Unlike Hiero, they sought to prevent a breakdown of political and social order in North Africa. Carthage's harbor was located on the side opposite the city's land walls, so while Mathos and Spendius at Tunis could observe the arrival and departure of naval and merchant ships, including transport vessels, they were powerless to stop them. For Hamilcar, the immediate priority was to focus on relieving Carthage, which required him to largely disregard much of Libya, a region that likely remained rebellious or had reverted to rebellion. In order to disrupt the besieging forces and cut off their supply lines, he, along with Hannibal and Narr'havas, would need to position themselves closer to Tunis. A strategic location for this could have been Thuburbo Minus, situated on the north bank of the Bagradas River, around 35 kilometers west of the rebel stronghold. To effectively block the besiegers' supply lines, Hamilcar had to divide his forces without spreading them too thinly. The best approach was likely to establish a few key bases in the region, supplemented by smaller strongpoints nearby. The goal was not to form a continuous line around Tunis, but to control the main supply routes, as most of the rebel supplies were transported by pack animals or wagons using these routes. While some supplies might have slipped through back roads or across fields, this would not be enough to sustain the large rebel forces. Narr'havas's cavalry, well known for striking fear into the rebels, could patrol the countryside, intimidating travelers and alerting nearby bases when necessary, where infantry and elephants could intervene. This strategy also explains why Hamilcar sought a reliable Carthaginian commander. Results would not be immediate, but a methodical approach involving regular patrols, local intelligence, and ongoing actions to instill fear could slowly weaken the besieging forces. Over time, Hamilcar's methods proved effective. The besieging forces began to experience shortages, which were exacerbated by the winter months, particularly if the siege had begun in the latter half of the year. With fewer munitions and financial resources available, the rebel supply lines became increasingly vulnerable. The reduction in supply trains made it easier for Hamilcar's forces to intercept them. Additionally, the dangers of winter sailing effectively cut off merchant ships from other regions, limiting supplies to Tunis, Utica, and Hippo Dioritis. While Hamilcar's own forces also faced difficult conditions with reduced rations and limited supplies, particularly for cavalry and elephants, they gradually gained the advantage. As Polybius notes, this situation effectively created two sieges, one within Carthage and one around it, with the latter proving increasingly difficult for the rebels to sustain. The rebels made no serious attempt, or at best, only failed attempts, to drive Hamilcar's forces away, though Polybius does not provide a clear explanation for this. It may be that the rebels were demoralized, with their leaders fearing further defeat, which could lead to their own downfall. Rather than facing two disjointed and conflicting Carthaginian commanders, the rebels now faced a unified command under Hamilcar, who was well supported by his lieutenants Hannibal and Narr'havas. It was only when the situation became truly desperate that the rebels finally broke out, likely in early 238 BC. Meanwhile, Mathos, Spendius, and Atrocities had no viable strategy other than to continue the siege of Carthage. Their successes in winning over Utica and Hippo Dioritis, while important in reviving the revolt, ultimately proved counterproductive. These cities provided few additional resources for the rebel effort, though they did free up the forces that had previously been tied up in their defense. While besieging Carthage had seemed like the logical next step, it eventually trapped the rebels in an untenable situation. They could neither capture the city nor evade Hamilcar's blockade, and with time, they were forced to face starvation. Ultimately, the rebels' endurance broke, and they lifted the siege of Carthage. Polybius leaves it somewhat unclear what this entailed, but it can be inferred that the rebel forces did not retreat to another part of Libya. Rather, they maintained control of Tunis and its surrounding area. In practice, Mathos and Spendius simply abandoned their positions outside Carthage's walls, relieving the city from the immediate threat of direct assault. However, the rebel forces still held key positions along the routes from Tunis and the Bagradas River to Utica and Hippo Diaritis. The land routes into Carthage remained blocked. Essentially, the rebels shifted from a direct siege to a form of blockade, continuing to isolate the city from a distance rather than mounting an ongoing siege. With the siege of Carthage ended, the war entered its final stage, and both sides were once again in the open field in 238 BC. The unsuccessful siege of Carthage in 238 BC dealt a significant blow to morale, both within the mercenary rebel army and across Libya. Compounding their difficulties, Hamilcar's relentless blockade continued to deprive them of food and essential supplies. Mathos and Spendius faced two remaining options. Either they had to defeat the Carthaginian field forces to have any hope of victory, or they would be forced to seek peace. However, surrender was not a viable choice for the rebel leadership. At best, they could expect a swift execution, but it was far more likely that Hamilcar intended a far grimmer fate, either the elephants or crucifixion. These same fears undoubtedly weighed on their officers and soldiers, all of whom recalled the atrocities committed outside Hippo Diaritis, as well as their own mistreatment of prisoners. Ironically, Hamilcar's policy of executing captured rebels only served to strengthen their resolve, sustaining the movement even in its most desperate hour. Polybius writes that after some time, they assembled the best of the mercenaries and the Libyans and advanced against the Carthaginian field forces. He uses the plural they immediately after mentioning Mathos and Spendius. However, as the campaign reaches its climax, Mathos is notably absent, and later he is explicitly placed at Tunis. Given that the campaign lasted for a considerable period, it is possible that he initially joined the other generals before returning to headquarters. However, this would have left Tunis without a senior commander for weeks or even months, which seems unlikely, especially considering that field operations were not Mathos's strength. A more plausible interpretation is that he remained in command at Tunis throughout the campaign, while Atrocities, Spendius, and the newly prominent Zarzas led the expeditionary force. Polybius estimates the rebel forces at 50,000 strong, noting that with them too was Zarzas the Libyan, leading those under his command. This marks Zarzas' first appearance in the narrative, and it is clear that he commanded his own division. Polybius' wording is particularly significant. His phrasing suggests that Zarzas' forces were in addition to the 50,000 troops, and that he distinguished them in a similar manner to how he had previously described Atrocities' Gauls during the first inland expedition. Zarzas must have possessed considerable military experience to not only command a division but also serve as one of the expeditionary leaders. It is possible that he had served in the Sicilian campaigns but had not been a prominent figure when the mercenary revolt began, instead rising through the ranks over time. However, the way Polybius describes his division suggests a degree of autonomy from the rest of the expeditionary force. An alternative possibility is that Zarzas was a Libyan noble with prior military experience who had recently raised a force independently and brought it to Tunis. The defections of Hippo Diaritis and Utica, along with Carthage's ongoing military failures, would have encouraged such a move. Yet, if he were a Libyan noble, why did he take so long to join the rebellion? One potential factor was the brutal tactics employed by Hamilcar, including mass executions, devastation of the countryside, and the sacking of settlements, measures intended to intimidate the Libyan population. These atrocities may have ultimately driven Zarzas to align with the rebels. The rebels' first critical objective was to force Hamilcar to withdraw. Securing the roads from the interior was essential to allow relief supplies to reach both the forces remaining in Tunis and the expeditionary army. Given Hamilcar's strategic acumen, it is unlikely that he would have allowed himself to be easily dislodged. For the starving troops under Spendius and his fellow commanders, the effort required was undoubtedly immense. Nevertheless, they succeeded, though Polybius provides little detail on how this was achieved. Instead, he describes the subsequent phase of the campaign as an extensive maneuvering contest across hills and valleys, with both sides striving to outflank one another. A plausible reconstruction of events can be proposed. At the beginning of the campaign, the Carthaginian forces were likely positioned to monitor the main routes leading to Tunis. Hamilcar may have controlled the Bagradas valley from a location such as Thuburbo Minus, while Hannibal held the territory to the southeast, possibly at Utica or Uthina. Meanwhile, Naravas, regardless of his exact base, was likely patrolling the area between them. These positions would have made it difficult for the rebels to break out. However, a swift and well-executed sortie from Tunis, possibly led by veteran troops and launched at night, similar to Hamilcar's earlier rapid advance from Carthage to the Bagradas, could have created enough disruption to prevent the Carthaginian commanders from coordinating an immediate response. Faced with this sudden assault, Hamilcar and Hannibal may have been forced to retreat inland to consolidate their forces, as neither could afford to hold his position without the support of the other. Consequently, Naravas would also have had to withdraw with them. In this way, the rebels managed to drive the Carthaginian field forces back into the countryside, after which they focused on wearing them down through continued maneuver warfare. Polybius outlines the tactical approach employed by the rebels, stating that they proceeded again to march parallel to the Punic forces on the open ground and shadow Hamilcar. Thus, they avoided level terrain, terrified as they were of his elephants and Naravas' cavalry, and strove to be the first to occupy the hills and passes. In essence, they adopted a strategy similar to that of their earlier expedition. Engaging Hamilcar in a single, slow-moving mass would have been futile. He could have easily outmaneuvered, outflanked, and harassed such a force before ultimately trapping it. Instead, the rebels needed to reverse these tactics and impose the same difficulties on him. This was not an unrealistic objective. Previously, Spendius and Atrocities had employed similar methods, successfully cornering Hamilcar. It was only the timely arrival of Numidian cavalry that had saved him on that occasion. At that time, he had been shadowed, harassed, and ultimately encircled by 3 coordinated enemy forces. Evidently, the rebel commanders sought to replicate this approach once again. Now, however, the rebels had only their own forces from Tunis at their disposal, whereas Hamilcar commanded a larger army. This suggests that they deployed the majority of their troops in order to maintain a numerical advantage. If they could isolate one division of the Punic forces from the rest, they could concentrate a strong contingent against it, while simultaneously positioning enough troops to delay or at least harass the reinforcements attempting to provide support. The isolated division would then face a critical decision, whether to stand and fight or to retreat. If it chose to withdraw, Spendius's logical response would be to attempt to cut it off from reuniting with the main force. Even if this effort failed, he could still hope to inflict significant losses during the retreat. Conversely, if the Carthaginian army remained united, the rebels would likely attempt to launch attacks from multiple directions to force a fragmentation of its ranks. Whatever cavalry the rebels had at their disposal would need to be deployed against Naravas' squadrons. However, it is evident that their cavalry was of inferior quality and almost certainly was also outnumbered. The rebels' tactics were extraordinarily risky, as they had to contend with all 3 branches of Hamilcar's forces: infantry, cavalry, and elephants. Naravas and the elephants, in particular, inspired great fear among them. It appears they had no elephants of their own, putting them at a further disadvantage. Moreover, Hamilcar was capable of employing the same strategies and tactics against them, and Polybius confirms that he did so. Yet, in their desperate circumstances, the rebels had little choice but to take these risks. Frustratingly, Polybius' account once again omits place names, provides no clear indication of the campaign's duration, and remains largely general in detail. However, he does acknowledge the rebels' aggressiveness and daring, an unusual compliment that he immediately tempers with criticism. He argues that they lacked the experience and vigor of generalship, being constrained by military unskillfulness and mindless routine. This assessment is clearly directed at Spendius, Atrocities, and Zarzas in contrast to Hamilcar. As a result, Polybius states, Hamilcar was able to conduct his campaign like a good draughts player, alternately cutting off enemy units, luring them into ambushes, or striking unexpectedly by day or night to throw them into panic. His narrative conveys a vivid sense of relentless marches and countermarches, sudden reversals, and diverse forms of combat, all culminating in Hamilcar's gradual ascendance. At this stage, Polybius shows little interest in precise geographical or chronological details, instead focusing on the moral and psychological dimensions of the conflict. Spendius and his fellow commanders maintained the cohesion of their forces, continued to engage in combat, and at times even gained the upper hand in the deadly contest unfolding across Libya's uplands. Polybius's acknowledgement of their aggressiveness and daring suggests that their morale remained high, a stark contrast to their first expedition a year and a half earlier, which had completely lost its will to resist following Hamilcar's and Narvaez's decisive victory. This renewed resilience would have been deeply frustrating for Hamilcar. His own forces suffered losses and, at times, must have faced shortages of supplies, which had to be sourced either from territories still loyal to Carthage, wherever they were located, or from communities compelled by force. In fact, much of the maneuvering on both sides likely centered on securing provisions while denying them to the enemy. However, the strategic objectives of the rebels and those of Hamilcar were not necessarily aligned. The rebels did not need to win a decisive battle. Their primary aim was to harass and exhaust the Carthaginian forces, drive them away from the coast, and cut off their supply lines. If they could achieve this, Hamilcar's army would gradually weaken, desertions would increase, and he would find himself isolated from Carthage. A pitched battle was precisely what the rebels sought to avoid, as Spendius and his fellow generals understood that they would almost certainly lose. Hamilcar, on the other hand, needed to force them into open battle, as a war of attrition favored the rebels who could afford greater losses. Confident in his ability to win a decisive engagement, Hamilcar sought to bring them to bay. At the same time, he could not afford to stray too far from Carthage, certainly not as far as the West, or even Sicca. Such a move had been viable earlier when he had near total freedom of movement, but with the rebels persistently shadowing his forces, an extended absence from Carthage could prove disastrous for morale at home. Worse still, if Spendius gained enough confidence, he might even detach some of his forces to renew the assault on the city itself. As both sides depended on supplies from the countryside, the conflict likely unfolded across the valleys and uplands between the Bagradas, Siliana, and Melon rivers. Byzantium is another possible theater of operations, though it seems less likely due to its greater distance from the rebel strongholds. The north coast, with its sparse settlements between the vicinity of Hippo Diaretus and Hippo Regius, offered little strategic appeal. Likewise, prolonged campaigning in desert or semi-desert regions would have been unsustainable, though the armies may have traversed such terrain at times. Given these geographical and logistical constraints, the most probable outcome was a series of maneuver-based engagements, characterized by zigzag movements, feints, counterfeints, skirmishes, and clashes, unfolding over a period of 2 months or more. However, no large-scale battles took place. Polybius describes full combats, but these primarily took the form of unexpected ambushes, or panicked retreats triggered by Hamilcar's sudden appearances. If significant pitched battles had occurred, they would likely have received more detailed treatment in his account and, more importantly, would have yielded more decisive outcomes. Despite the narrative's generally favorable stance toward Hamilcar, it primarily recounts intermittent skirmishes, ambushes, and strategic maneuvers, many of which did not escalate into full-scale combat. Moreover, as previously noted, not all of these actions were initiated by Hamilcar, nor did all of them work to his advantage. After each successful engagement, Hamilcar, as ruthless as ever, executed all prisoners. Spendius and the rebels, however, took a different approach. One possible reason for this leniency was to instill hope among Hamilcar's troops that if captured, they might be spared, thereby discouraging them from fighting to the death when faced with inevitable defeat. Additionally, it is possible that the rebel army, having brought only a limited number of slaves from Tunis during its breakout, found captured prisoners useful as additional laborers. In stark contrast, Hamilcar's brutality likely had the opposite effect. reinforcing the rebels' determination to resist until the very end of the campaign. His relentless execution of prisoners gave them little incentive to surrender, ensuring that the conflict remained fierce and protracted. Polybius concludes the campaign by describing how Spendius and his forces found themselves trapped at a location known as the Saw, completely surrounded and unable to advance or retreat. Hamilcar had successfully corralled them, leaving them at his mercy. Frustratingly, Polybius provides no details on how this strategic maneuver was executed. Furthermore, his description of the terrain is notably vague. At this point, Hamilcar unexpectedly encamped opposite them and proceeded to encircle them with a ditch and palisade, sealing their fate. A plausible scenario can be reconstructed. After months of marching, countermarching, and intermittent skirmishes, Spendius and his forces arrived in the region of the Saw. It is evident that they had lost contact with Hamilcar, who may have deliberately misled them into believing he had withdrawn to forage elsewhere. With no immediate threat in sight, the rebels established their camp. The location must have seemed strategically advantageous. Whatever natural feature the Saw referred to, it likely provided a sense of security, perhaps preventing an approach from one direction. Additionally, the area had access to water, as Hamilcar relied on starvation rather than dehydration to weaken his opponents. Had thirst been a factor, the siege would have ended much more swiftly. This suggests that the surrounding region contained some degree of cultivation, allowing the army to replenish supplies upon setting up camp. It is possible that the rebels remained there for several days, gathering resources, while Spendius and his fellow commanders deliberated on their next move in the ongoing struggle against Hamilcar. Instead, Hamilcar located them. It is likely that he had been tracking the rebel army from a distance, relying on Numidian scouts who would have been difficult to detect if they wished to remain unseen. Almost certainly, the rebels had grown complacent, neglecting proper vigilance, perhaps even failing to station lookouts on the crest of the Saw. A night march, we may reasonably infer, brought Hamilcar's forces into position. As dawn broke, the rebels were confronted with an alarming sight. The Carthaginian army had established a camp of its own, directly opposite them. The logical response for the rebels would have been to march out and attack, before the Carthaginians could fully establish their position. But Polybius's account does not explicitly indicate a direct engagement. Instead, he emphasizes that the terrain was unfavorable for the rebels, while advantageous for Hamilcar's forces. Moreover, he states twice that, throughout the ordeal, the rebels avoided battle entirely. Hamilcar reduced them to such dire conditions that they neither dared to fight nor had any means of escape. Polybius describes their desperation, noting that they were driven to cannibalism, yet still refrained from marching out to engage in combat. He attributes this hesitation to their fear of certain defeat and the brutal consequences of capture, likely heightened by their terror of Hamilcar's elephants. Thus, Spendius, Atrocities, and Zarzas kept their men confined within the camp, watching helplessly as the Carthaginians methodically enclosed them. Hamilcar's forces dug a ditch and constructed a palisade around the rebels, effectively sealing them in. At the Saw, the rebels had access to water, but limited food supplies. The fluid nature of the campaign would have made it difficult for either army to maintain a steady supply of provisions or transport large stockpiles. Even if the rebels had managed to secure some fresh supplies before their entrapment, the ensuing stalemate meant that, as these dwindled, they could not be replenished. The season was likely early to midsummer, meaning increasingly hot days and stifling nights. Spendius's forces found themselves in a predicament similar to that of the entire rebel army during its earlier siege of Carthage. They exhausted their remaining provisions and soon faced starvation. Driven by desperation and fear of their enemies, they resorted to cannibalism, first consuming their prisoners, then turning on their own slaves. Several messengers were dispatched to Tunis, but it remains unknown whether any reached their destination. The rebels endured, hoping that Mathos would lead a relief force from Tunis to save them. Whether Mathos was ever informed of their plight is uncertain. He may not have received the messages, or he may have felt unable to act, constrained by the presence of the 10,000 defenders of Carthage under Hanno. The dire situation in the rebel camp led to growing unrest. Spendius, Atrocities, Zarzas, and their lieutenants had managed to maintain control over their men, primarily by promising that relief would soon arrive. However, as hope for this dwindled and the food supply continued to deplete, morale faltered. Unsurprisingly, the men began to direct their frustration toward their commanders. Spendius and his colleagues now faced physical threats from their own soldiers, and, like Hamilcar, both the generals and the rank and file were all too aware of the fate of Gisco and his fellow commanders. At this point, events unfolded rapidly. A herald was selected and sent to Hamilcar, an action steeped in irony. These were the same rebels who had once vowed a gruesome death to any herald dispatched to them, yet now they were the ones seeking an audience. Naturally, Hamilcar listened to their message. The rebel generals and their immediate subordinates were requesting permission to approach him for negotiations, an implicit acknowledgement of their defeat. Polybius states that the rebel leaders had decided to hand themselves over to the enemy and discuss a settlement with Hamilcar. In essence, they offered to enter his camp in person, placing themselves entirely at his mercy. Not only did Spendius, Atrocities, and Zarzas agree to go, but also their 7 chief lieutenants, the entire high command of the army. They appear to have gone unarmed, as Polybius makes no mention of weapons or attendants. The decision for the leadership of the trapped army to place themselves directly in Hamilcar's hands suggests either an extraordinary naivety, which seems unlikely for seasoned commanders like Spendius and the battle-hardened Atrocities, or an acceptance of their fate as sacrificial victims, willing to sacrifice themselves for the army's survival. Hamilcar once again demonstrated his skill as a shrewd political strategist. The terms he offered appeared remarkably lenient. He demanded only the right to select 10 men from among the rebels to detain, while the rest would be permitted to depart freely, each with a single tunic. The rebel leaders readily agreed to these conditions, believing them to be fair. However, Hamilcar then exercised his right to choose the hostages and selected the rebel high command, including Spendius, Atrocities, and Zarzas. In doing so, he effectively neutralized the leadership of the rebel army without violating the sacred rules of parley, which forbade the seizure of enemy envoys. What followed was dramatic, though. Once again, Polybius condenses his account. The rebel troops soon learned that their commanders had been arrested, but they were unaware that an agreement had been reached. Suspecting treachery, they armed themselves in preparation for battle. However, they were already too late. The initiative had passed to Hamilcar. Before the now leaderless rebels could attempt to break out of their encirclement, they found themselves confronted by enemy troops and elephants ready to strike. It is unlikely that the entire Punic army, especially its elephants and cavalry, had been continuously positioned along the full extent of the ditch and palisade since the beginning of the blockade. Such a deployment would have dangerously dispersed Hamilcar's forces and does not align with Polybius's statement that the Carthaginian general now surrounded the rebels with his elephants and the rest of his army. More plausibly, a portion of Hamilcar's troops had been patrolling the perimeter while the majority remained in reserve within the camp, prepared for a decisive engagement. Now, with the moment at hand, Hamilcar deployed his entire force for the final assault. It is also possible that Hamilcar had already positioned his forces in anticipation of this moment. If he had kept Spendius and the other rebel leaders in his camp overnight before presenting them with his terms, he may have used the cover of darkness to move his troops into position, ensuring that when the rebels realized what had happened, they would find themselves entirely at his mercy. The final outcome becomes more logical if we consider that Hamilcar himself may have ensured that the news of Spendius and the other leaders' arrest reached the rebel troops. A deserter feigning defection, a slave promised freedom in exchange for delivering the message, or even a shouted declaration from the Punic camp would have sufficed. Polybius describes the rebels as believing that they had been betrayed, and it is important to note that their suspicions need not have been solely directed at Hamilcar. The perception of betrayal could have extended to their own commanders, creating further confusion and panic among the rebels. Even without suspicions of betrayal, the rebel chain of command was shattered, and Hamilcar gave them no time to recover. As dawn broke, his forces surged forward, crossing the barricades and hemming the rebels into an ever-tightening noose. With their commanders absent and fear gripping the ranks, the rebels were slow to react. By the time they realized what was happening, the Carthaginians had already gained the initiative. The encampment, which had once seemed like a refuge, became a death trap. With the Punic forces pressing in from all sides, the rebels had nowhere to run. Desperate men attempted to claw their way out, but they were cut down at the barricades or driven back into the chaos behind them. The confined space turned the battle into a brutal, frenzied melee. Without direction or discipline, the rebels fought like cornered animals, wielding swords, spears, and whatever weapons they could find in a desperate bid to stay alive. Some tried to form defensive lines, but panic spread like wildfire as Carthaginian infantry hacked their way through. Mercy was a luxury, neither offered nor requested. The Carthaginians, still seething over the gruesome execution of their beloved commander Gisco and his men, showed no mercy. Their ranks fought with grim determination, eager to exact vengeance. Naravas and his Numidian cavalry patrolled the perimeter, ensuring no one could escape. Any rebels who managed to break through the initial lines were swiftly hunted down and slaughtered. As the rebels faltered, Hamilcar unleashed his war elephants. The massive beasts crashed through the camp, their drivers directing them to trample anything in their path. The rebels who had managed to hold their ground now faced an unstoppable force. Those too weak to fight, wounded or exhausted from starvation, were crushed beneath the elephants' feet. Others, seeing no way out, threw down their weapons and attempted to surrender, but there was no clemency to be found. The slaughter lasted for hours. Blood ran in rivulets through the camp as the once defiant rebel army was systematically annihilated. The air was thick with the stench of death, the cries of the wounded drowned out by the relentless advance of the Carthaginian forces. By the end, the battlefield was silent. According to Polybius, the rebel army had still numbered around 40,000 before this final engagement. Now they were no more. Those who had not been cut down in battle were rounded up and subjected to the same fate as earlier prisoners, trampled beneath the elephants in a grim spectacle of Carthaginian retribution. With the rebel army annihilated and its leaders either captured or slain, the war was now nearing its end. Hamilcar had achieved one of the most decisive victories of his career, proving his tactical brilliance once more. But the rebels were not entirely finished, and though their numbers had been devastated, resistance would continue in isolated pockets. The final reckoning was still to come. Once again, the Carthaginian forces advanced in 3 divisions commanded by Hamilcar, Hannibal, and Naravas, who led the cavalry. As they moved through the countryside, they secured control over many communities, either by accepting their voluntary submission or compelling their cooperation. It is reasonable to assume that most did not require coercion, given that many Libyans were changing sides and joining them due to Carthage's recent successes. With the main rebel forces already defeated, only a few elements remained in opposition, primarily the troops under Mathos at Tunis, along with scattered local militias and isolated garrisons of regular rebel soldiers. Most of these militias likely had little will left to continue resisting. As a result, most of the towns came under Punic control. This represented a notable shift from Hamilcar's earlier inland campaign, when he had often been compelled to use force to ensure submission. However, not all of rebel-controlled Libya aligned with Carthage. Cities such as Utica and Hippodiaritis continued to resist, and it is unlikely that the entire interior was brought under control in this single campaign. Such an undertaking would have required several months. Instead, The Carthaginian advance appears to have focused on the region between the Sau and Tunis, most likely encompassing the Bagradas Valley and surrounding areas between the Bagradas, Siliana, and Melon rivers. Meanwhile, Spendius, Atrocities, Zarzas, and other rebel commanders were kept alive. Although they were undoubtedly treated harshly, Hamilcar had specific plans for them, and they were not executed, at least not immediately. Rather than being subjected to death by elephants, as was sometimes the fate of captured enemies, these rebel leaders were retained and moved with Hamilcar's army during its next operations. Mathos's forces at Tunis now became the primary objective for the Carthaginians. The news of the recent defeat likely came as no great shock to him, even if he still harbored some hope that Spendius might somehow break through and rejoin him. By this point, Mathos must have realized that the rebellion was effectively lost, and that his own fate was sealed. It was merely a matter of time before Hamilcar's victorious forces appeared on the hills and plains surrounding Tunis. In theory, the rebels could have abandoned their position and attempted to find refuge elsewhere, perhaps at Utica or Hippodiaritis. But they chose to remain. This was not because Hamilcar moved too swiftly and cut off their retreat. In fact, he was still occupied in the interior, reasserting control over the countryside. Nor is it likely that the Carthaginian defenders at home would have been able or willing to stop the rebels from leaving. The underlying issue was that there was no truly safe destination for them. Utica, while nearby, was too small to shelter an army that may have still numbered over 20,000. Attempting a march toward Hippodiaritis would have involved considerable risk, especially with Narvaez and his feared cavalry likely to intercept them along the way. Remaining positioned around Tunis did offer the rebels certain advantages. On the seaward side, there was still potential access to supplies from merchants bold enough to evade Carthaginian naval patrols. Overland, the geography provided natural defenses. Hamilcar's army, despite its strength, could not completely encircle the town. To the west lay the salt marsh of Sebket Sejumi, while hills bordered the area to the north, south, and west. Following the rebel defeat at the Sau in August 238 BC, the victorious Carthaginian forces likely needed a few more weeks to advance through Libya to the coast. It would not have made strategic sense to leave Mathos and the remaining rebel forces around Tunis undisturbed for an extended period, such as several months. From the Carthaginian perspective, the city of Carthage itself remained vulnerable to the threat posed by the desperate rebels at Tunis. Alternatively, the rebels could use a prolonged delay to escape and continue their resistance elsewhere. Based on this, it can be estimated that Hamilcar and Hannibal reached Tunis around the beginning of October. Upon arriving near Tunis, Hamilcar divided his army into two parts. He took command of the southern position with half the forces, while his subordinate, Hannibal, established a camp to the north with the remainder. Confronted with the presence of a large Carthaginian force, Mathos abandoned the rebel camp outside the city and withdrew his troops within the walls of Tunis. Facing experienced Carthaginian soldiers, bolstered by Narvaez's cavalry and war elephants, he likely judged the city's fortifications to offer better protection than a temporary field camp. It is reasonable to assume that Hamilcar retained Narvaez and his Numidian horsemen alongside his own contingent. These Carthaginian deployments were largely shaped by the local topography, which in any case appeared to work in their favor. By positioning forces to the north and south, the two generals were able to exert pressure on both of the city's accessible sides. Their strategy seems to have been an attempt to replicate the earlier encirclement of Spendius's army, this time using the city of Carthage and the Gulf of Tunis as natural barriers, much like the Sau had functioned in the previous engagement to block any potential rebel escape routes. Any alternative strategy would have posed serious challenges. For example, a concentrated assault on Tunis from the narrow southern approach could easily have been repelled, resulting in significant Carthaginian casualties. A northern assault carried similar risks, or worse, it might have prompted the rebels to flee southward into the Zaguin Mountains. From there, they could have broken out into the recently subdued Libyan interior, or moved toward any remaining sympathetic centers in Byzantium to reignite the conflict. Even so, the The chosen strategy, a partial blockade, carried risks of its own. Although Hamilcar's total forces were roughly equal to those of the rebels, he had now divided them around a concentrated enemy. Communication between the two Carthaginian camps and with Carthage itself could be maintained relatively easily by water, but overland movement between the two positions would have required a 25-kilometer march. Hamilcar was clearly relying on psychological pressure, the fear inspired by Narrabas's cavalry and the war elephants. He had no intention of launching a direct assault. Instead, he intended for the blockade itself, combined with fear and isolation, to erode the morale of the defenders. To that end, once the camps were established, he began with a calculated act designed to strike terror into every man inside Tunis. Before long, the Carthaginians brought Spendius and the other captured rebel leaders to the walls of Tunis and crucified them in full view of the defenders. The site of the execution was likely the open ground between the northern walls of the city and Hannibal's camp. This location also allowed citizens from nearby Carthage to witness the event, serving as a powerful morale boost for them. It is also probable that the executions were preceded by torture and mutilation, carried out in deliberate retaliation for the brutal treatment inflicted on Gisco and his companions earlier in the war. The crosses bearing the bodies were left exposed to the elements, wind, rain, and scavenging birds, to further degrade the dead and terrify the living. After overseeing this grim spectacle, Hamilcar returned to his camp. Both he and Hannibal may have believed that such a psychological blow would break the will of the defenders. Even if Mathos remained defiant, they likely hoped that his own troops, shaken by the sight, would turn against him to avoid total destruction. Hamilcar, positioned on the lower ground and without immediate access to Carthage, maintained a heightened state of readiness in his camp, anticipating the possibility of a rebel sortie. His colleague Hannibal, by contrast, appears to have been less vigilant. Polybius notes that Mathos observed Hannibal acting carelessly and overconfidently. In practical terms, such carelessness likely manifested in poor patrol routines, lax sentry duties, and perhaps a general decline in discipline among the troops. The men in Hannibal's camp may have felt secure behind their fortifications, assuming that the rebels had been thoroughly demoralized and were no longer a threat. Their proximity to Carthage may have further contributed to a false sense of safety. It likely took Mathos no more than a day or two to notice the growing complacency in Hannibal's camp. Once confident in the situation, he acted decisively. At dawn, a time when many soldiers would still be waking and routines were most relaxed, he launched a surprise attack with a substantial force. The result was a swift and overwhelming victory. The rebel troops quickly breached the palisade, catching the defenders unprepared. Hannibal's soldiers were either cut down in the confusion, taken prisoner, or forced to flee, while the attackers seized control of the camp and captured its contents. Though the sources do not detail what comprised the captured baggage, it is reasonable to infer that it included weapons and armor, items the Carthaginian troops had no time to properly don during the surprise assault. Other likely spoils included food supplies, pack animals, transport wagons, and perhaps even the military pay chest. The most significant outcome, however, was the capture of Hannibal himself. Reportedly captured with him were 30 of Carthage's most distinguished citizens, likely high-ranking officers or political figures. Before news of the defeat could reach Hamilcar, Mathos took swift action to reclaim the symbolic and emotional ground lost in previous weeks. He ordered the bodies of the executed rebel leaders to be taken down from their crosses and given proper burial rites. What followed, however, was an even more grim and calculated act than Hamilcar's earlier crucifixions. Hannibal, still alive but in a state of extreme suffering, was brought to the site and subjected to brutal torments. In a chilling act of retribution, he was eventually nailed, still breathing, to the same cross that had once borne Spendius's body. For the rebels, it is reasonable to assume that Hannibal served as a symbolic stand-in for Hamilcar, whom they undoubtedly wished to capture or punish in his place. After Hannibal's death, Mathos conducted a ritualized scene of retribution. The body of Spendius was laid out with care, perhaps in imitation of traditional funerary rites, and the 30 Carthaginian captives taken in the earlier assault were placed around him. One by one, they were executed, transforming the event into a grim spectacle of justice in the eyes of the rebels. Hamilcar's original tactical arrangements for the blockade, dividing his forces between two camps, had unintentionally aided the enemy by preventing rapid mutual support between the divisions in the event of a sudden attack. Polybius suggests that Hamilcar did attempt to come to Hannibal's aid, but the effort was too late. As he records, Barca was late in learning of the attack from the town due to the distance between the camps. When he did learn, he could not rush aid forward because of the difficult terrain between them. With Hannibal's troops either killed or routed, Hamilcar's own position, situated between the salt marsh and the sea, became strategically unsustainable. Mathos's forces, now bolstered by captured supplies and arms from Hannibal's camp, outnumbered Hamilcar's and posed a renewed threat. It was unlikely that they would simply retreat back into Tunis to resume a passive defense. Despite their significant victory, remaining in Tunis would be a dead end for the rebels. They could neither prevent reinforcements from reaching Hamilcar, nor afford to risk an attack on Carthage. However, their triumph, and the new resources it provided, gave them one final opportunity to break out from their confinement and attempt to reignite the war elsewhere. Rather than retreat into his camp and face the superior numbers of Mathos's forces, Hamilcar made the strategic decision to withdraw. He broke camp and maneuvered around the salt marsh and hills, heading toward the mouth of the Bagradas River. At this point, it was clear that engaging Mathos in direct combat would be unwise, especially without first rallying the remnants of Hannibal's division and, ideally, receiving reinforcements from Carthage. Attempting to re-establish a blockade of Tunis from the north was also deemed impractical. Even if additional troops could be called up from Carthage, it would have been risky to try and reassert control over the area without a more solidified force. The journey from Hamilcar's camp to the mouth of the Bagradas River spanned approximately 35 kilometers. The army would have spent a full day of hard marching to cover this distance, or at the very least, the 26 kilometers to reach the bridge near La Sabala. Despite being only about 15 kilometers away from the same bridge, the rebels did not engage Hamilcar as he advanced toward it. Though they outnumbered him, Hamilcar's forces included elephants and the cavalry of Naravas, which likely deterred any attempt at an attack. If any of Mathos's officers had advised a more aggressive response, their proposals were evidently dismissed, and, if necessary, suppressed by customary disciplinary measures. By failing to act, the rebels squandered their final opportunity to seize back the strategic initiative. Once in position near the river, Hamilcar successfully re-established contact with Carthage. Mathos was left with two realistic options: to launch an attack against Hamilcar's battle-hardened forces, or to retreat. Ultimately, he judged that holding Tunis was no longer viable and instead led his army southward, covering a distance of roughly 160 kilometers to the affluent port city of Leptis Parva. Situated in the fertile region of Byzantium, Leptis Parva offered both strategic depth and access to resources. In hindsight, Mathos's decision not to confront Hamilcar near the Bagradas may be viewed as a missed opportunity. With an estimated 20,000 men still under his command, many of whom were rearmed with equipment captured from Hannibal's camp, he outnumbered Hamilcar's force of 10,000 to 12,000. A determined assault, despite the risks, might have broken through Carthaginian lines and shifted the momentum. Instead, Mathos chose to abandon Tunis altogether and turn toward the countryside in the opposite direction, effectively ceding the strategic initiative to Hamilcar. Although Mathos escaped from Tunis, his luck soon ran out, and by late 238 BC, he was forced to face the full might of the Carthaginian army in the final battle at Leptis Parva. When news of Hannibal's unexpected defeat reached Carthage, it plunged the population once again into grief and despair. Just as the people had begun to regain confidence, their hopes were abruptly dashed. Yet, despite the emotional blow, the Carthaginians did not hesitate to act decisively. The Senate appointed 30 of its members, along with the previously dismissed General Hanno, and mobilized all remaining men of military age, treating the situation as a final, desperate effort to save the Republic, and dispatched them to reinforce Hamilcar Barca. The Senate gave the 30 envoys a specific and urgent mandate to do everything possible to reconcile Hamilcar and Hanno, whose prior disagreements had hindered cooperation. Given the seriousness of the crisis, the senators were instructed to ensure that the two commanders would now take joint counsel and act in unison. Their efforts proved successful. Through a range of persuasive arguments presented at the meeting, the senators ultimately compelled both Hamilcar and Hanno to put aside their differences and cooperate for the greater good. The sequence of events that followed is particularly difficult to reconstruct, largely because Polybius, eager to bring the narrative of the war to a close, offers only the briefest of details. What is clear is that Hamilcar and Hanno were not far behind Mathos in the pursuit. They likely advanced through Tunis, now deserted, rather than taking the longer route west of the city, which would have risked leaving the road to Utica open for the rebels to escape north. Polybius's emphasis on the renewed cooperation between the generals suggests that, at some point, either from the outset or as they approached the Gulf of Hammamet, they divided their forces in order to maintain continuous pressure on Mathos from multiple directions. The most logical arrangement would have seen Hamilcar command his own veteran troops, along with the remnants of Hannibal's defeated division, while Hanno led the newly raised forces from Carthage. It is plausible that in the series of engagements that followed, the Carthaginian commanders sought to gradually exhaust Mathos's forces and, ideally, compel him into a decisive confrontation. Polybius mentions that these clashes occurred around Leptis and some of the other cities. Repeatedly defeated and with his field army steadily shrinking, Mathos eventually opted for a final gamble. He committed to a pitched battle, hoping to reverse the tide. Polybius notes that both sides called on their remaining allies and garrisons at this stage. For the rebels, however, their allies were few and scattered, especially in central Libya. Any rebel forces attempting to move east would likely have been intercepted by Hanno or Hamilcar. The only significant garrisons left were at Utica and Hippodiaritis, and sending troops from these locations would have required a perilous 200-kilometer march. Other parts of Libya may have still held out, but they too could not afford to send help. Ultimately, Mathos had to rely on whatever local forces he could gather. The rebels likely had around 20,000 men after leaving Tunis, though desertions on the march probably reduced their numbers. Some may have fled to their hometowns or ports in search of escape, and perhaps even a few joined Hamilcar. While the Carthaginian army also faced desertions, few would have joined the rebels. Ongoing skirmishes caused further losses, but with some reinforcements arriving, Mathos may have rebuilt his force to about 20,000 by the time of the final battle. It's unclear exactly where the Carthaginians got their reinforcements from. Most Libyans were still seen as unreliable after the revolt, so few would have joined. The generals may have requested more troops from Carthage, which wasn't under immediate threat. New mercenaries were likely still arriving, and Carthage had the weapons to arm them. Local militias from Byzantium and Cape Bon may also have been added to the army. By the time of the final battle, the Punic forces were likely stronger than the rebels. Hamilcar and Hanno initially had around 25,000 troops, but after reinforcements and some casualties, they probably had at least 30,000. This battle likely took place in late 238, around 8 to 10 weeks after their arrival in Byzantium, allowing time for the clashes and reinforcements to arrive on both sides. The location and details of the final battle in Byzantium are unknown. Hamilcar and Hanno likely aimed for a decisive victory from the beginning, while Mathos hoped to delay them and either secure peace or escape. In the end, he realized a full-scale battle was his only option. Polybius describes the final battle as a formal set-piece engagement with both armies facing off and clashing at an agreed signal. By this stage, Mathos's forces were no longer the seasoned veterans of earlier campaigns. Many of his original comrades from the army that had served in Sicily had already been killed in battle, trampled by elephants, executed, or lost to disease. Now he mostly commanded local Libyans who had joined during the rebellion. Polybius even refers to them simply as Libyans, suggesting this shift in the army's composition. Though these men were tough and courageous, they likely faced superior numbers and had the disadvantage of a less experienced commander. Mathos had previously relied on others, like Spendius, for battlefield leadership. His recent victory over Hannibal had come from exploiting a general's carelessness, not from tactical brilliance. Against the disciplined and determined forces of Hamilcar and Hanno, Mathos could no longer rely on such an advantage. The result of the battle, therefore, was predictable. According to Polybius, most of the Libyan rebels were killed during the battle. Some survivors fled to a nearby town where they soon surrendered. Mathos himself was captured, bringing the rebellion to an end. Polybius gives very few details about how the battle unfolded, so it's hard to reconstruct the exact course of events. However, we can assume that Hanno and the Numidian leader Narrabas took part in the fighting. Still, it was Hamilcar who received most of the credit, clearly recognized as the senior commander in the campaign. The fact that some rebels surrendered after the battle suggests that Hamilcar was once again offering mercy to defeated enemies. Showing clemency made sense at this stage. With the rebellion nearly over and its leaders dealt with, further brutality would achieve little. Instead, sparing the lives of captured soldiers and showing leniency to towns that surrendered was a more practical and constructive approach to restoring order. The Libyan countryside was quickly brought back under control. Only Utica and Hippodiaritis resisted for a short time, fearing harsh punishment from Carthage. But by early 237 BC, both cities were captured and forced to accept terms. Most rebels who were taken alive were crucified, except for Mathos. In 237 BC, he was paraded through the streets of Carthage in a mock triumph, perhaps a twisted version of the victory procession he had once imagined for himself. As he was dragged through the city, young Carthaginians tortured him in brutal and humiliating ways. In the words of the historian Polybius, a war that far excelled all wars we know of in cruelty and defiance of principle, came to an end with a death that was equally grim and symbolic. After 3 years and 4 months, the mercenary revolt was finally brought to an end. But the cost was devastating. The loss of human life and resources was immense, and the extreme brutality on both sides only added to the suffering. Much of this could have been avoided if Carthage had fulfilled its original obligation to pay the Sicilian veterans. In the end, the small debt they tried to avoid paying was nothing compared to the vast cost of the war. The rebel leaders met gruesome ends, mirroring the cruelty they themselves had shown. The entire conflict stands as a grim example of how betrayal undermines loyalty and how cycles of terror only fuel more violence.